Roadside deaths are not always the result of simple accidents. Some are bizarre, terrifying, and almost impossible to believe. From freak collisions to haunting mishaps that unfolded in plain sight, these cases prove that even a routine drive or a roadside stop can end in unimaginable horror. Today, we're diving into the 5 most horrifying roadside deaths ever, stories that blur the line between tragedy and nightmare.
Well, just after 5 in the evening here in London, and the news that they're hearing on their evening newscast is literally rocking this city. To boil it all down, late word from Paris is that in fact the driver of the car may have been drunk.
In the early hours of August 31st, 1997, the world awoke to news that would shake it to its core. Diana, Princess of Wales, a woman adored across continents and often described as the People's Princess, had been involved in a devastating car accident in Paris. Just after midnight, Diana and her companion, Dodi Fayed, left the Ritz Hotel in a black Mercedes S2Y. With them was their driver, Henry Paul, and Diana's bodyguard, Trevor Rees-Jones. The car slipped out of the hotel's rear entrance, a decoy move to avoid the mob of photographers at the front, and sped through the Paris streets toward Dodi's apartment. Moments later, tragedy struck inside the Pont de l'Alma tunnel. At approximately 12:23 a.m., the Mercedes, traveling at high speed, clipped a white Fiat Uno and swerved out of control. It slammed into the 13th pillar of the tunnel with devastating force. Henry Paul and Dodi Fayed were killed instantly, while Trevor Rees-Jones somehow survived despite horrific injuries. Diana was still alive, though gravely wounded. Witnesses recalled hearing her faintly whisper, "Oh my God," and plead for help as chaos unfolded around the wreckage. Within minutes, first responders arrived, and among the first was Dr. Frederick Mallier, an off-duty physician who attempted to stabilize her until emergency crews could take over. Diana was found with severe chest trauma, internal bleeding, and multiple fractures. Rescuers struggled for nearly an hour to free her from the wreckage before she was rushed to Pitié-Salpêtrière Hospital. En route, she went into cardiac arrest and was resuscitated, but the injuries were too grave. Her heart had been displaced in the crash, tearing major blood vessels. Despite the efforts of surgeons and doctors, Diana was pronounced dead at 4:00 a.m. The announcement was made public 2 hours later, and within minutes, grief rippled across the globe. What followed was an unprecedented outpouring of sorrow. Outside Kensington Palace, seas of flowers began to pile up, with more than 1 million bouquets left in the days that followed. Across Britain and the wider world, people wept openly in streets, churches, and schools. Television stations suspended regular programming to cover the story continuously. Diana's death was more than the passing of a royal figure. It felt like a collective wound to millions who saw in her someone who embodied compassion. Almost immediately, questions arose about how such a tragedy could have happened. French authorities launched an inquiry that concluded Henri Paul had been intoxicated and driving at more than twice the speed limit. Later, British investigations added that the relentless pursuit by paparazzi contributed to the crash. None of the passengers had been wearing seatbelts, which might have increased their chances of survival. The mysterious Fiat Uno involved in the collision was never conclusively traced, adding fuel to conspiracy theories that Diana's death had not been accidental. Dodi's father, Mohammed Al-Fayed, publicly claimed that the crash was part of a wider plot, accusations that have lingered for decades, despite official findings of unlawful killing due to reckless driving and media harassment. On September 6, 1997, Diana's funeral took place at Westminster Abbey. An estimated 2.5 billion people watched the service on television, making it one of the most viewed broadcasts in history. The ceremony brought together royalty, world leaders, and celebrities, but it was the ordinary mourners, lining the streets in their thousands, who captured the true scale of her influence. Elton John performed a reworked version of Candle in the Wind that would go on to become the best-selling single of all time, while her brother, Earl Spencer, delivered a powerful eulogy condemning the way his sister had been treated both by the press and, indirectly, by the royal family. After the ceremony, Diana was laid to rest at her family's estate in Althorpe, where she remains today. The death of Diana reshaped the monarchy and the media forever. The royal family faced intense criticism for their initial silence, which many saw as cold and detached, forcing them to adapt in the face of public anger. The press, too, came under scrutiny, accused of playing a direct role in the tragedy through their relentless pursuit of Diana in life and in her final hours. More than 2 decades later, her death remains a defining event of modern history, one that still casts a long shadow.
Well, I can see the green Glasgow City Council bin lorry, which is right outside Queen Street Station at the corner of George Square. It appears to have come to a halt into the side of a wall.
It was 2 days before Christmas in 2014, and the streets of Glasgow were alive with the bustle of holiday shoppers. Families filled George Square, children tugged at their parents' hands, and the air was laced with the glow of Christmas lights and the warmth of festivity. But what should have been a joyful afternoon of shopping and celebration turned into a nightmare in the space of just 19 seconds. At 2:30 p.m., a council bin lorry suddenly veered off course, mounting the pavement and plowing through crowds of people who had no time to react. By the time the lorry came to a halt near Queen Street railway station, 6 lives had been lost and 15 others were left injured. Their lives forever scarred by an event that would haunt Glasgow for years. The driver of the 26-ton vehicle was 58-year-old Harry Clark. Moments before the crash, witnesses saw nothing out of the ordinary. But then, without warning, Clark slumped unconscious at the wheel, and the lorry became a runaway giant. It accelerated to 25 miles per hour as it surged up the pavement, crushing barriers, colliding with walls and striking pedestrians. People screamed and scattered. When it finally came to a stop, wedged between a hotel and the entrance to the station, the festive scene had been replaced with horror. Emergency crews rushed to the carnage, weaving through crowds of stunned witnesses. What they found was devastation. 6 people dead, including 3 members of the same family, and many more lying wounded on the pavement where seconds earlier they had been walking in peace. The victims' names soon echoed across the nation. Erin McQuaid, just 18, had been out with her grandparents, Jack and Lorraine Sweeney, when all 3 were killed together in an instant. 2 local women, 29-year-old primary school teacher Stephanie Tate and 51-year-old Jacqueline Morton, lost their lives as well. So did 52-year-old Gillian Ewing, originally from Edinburgh. The randomness of the loss, the sheer cruelty of a joyful afternoon ending in such brutality, left Glasgow shaken. Harry Clark, the man behind the wheel, had blacked out. He claimed to remember nothing of the incident, and doctors would later diagnose him with a condition known as neurocardiogenic syncope, a fainting episode caused by a sudden drop in blood pressure. But the crash wasn't simply a matter of medical bad luck. Investigations revealed that Clark had a long history of dizziness and fainting, dating back decades, including a blackout at the wheel of a bus years earlier. When prosecutors announced that Clark would not face criminal charges because he had been unconscious and therefore could not form criminal intent, outrage rippled through the victims' families. They could not accept that someone with such a history of health problems had been allowed to drive a 26-ton lorry through a crowded city. Their anger deepened when it emerged that Clark had even misled the DVLA and his own GP about his fainting history. To the families, this was not an unavoidable accident. It was negligence, deception, and a failure of the system. Yet still, Clark walked free. The pain did not end there. In 2015, less than a year after the tragedy, Clark was arrested again, this time on suspicion of driving without a license, despite having been banned. For many, it felt like a cruel insult added to unbearable injury. The image of him back behind the wheel when so many had died was almost too much to bear. Eventually, his licenses were revoked and he was banned from heavy vehicle driving for 10 years. But that was little comfort to those who had buried loved ones.
The bus involved in the crash near Gurrick that killed 15 university students was in sound mechanical condition before the incident.
On June 9, 2025, with the students of Sultan Idris Education University celebrating Eid al-Adha with their families, boarded a bus that was supposed to take them safely back to campus. The east-west highway itself is notorious. Built nearly 60 years ago, it winds through steep hills and thick forests, a narrow two-lane road with sharp curves and dangerous descents. At night, it becomes even more treacherous. Survivors later said the bus was descending one of those bends far too quickly. The driver agitated, sometimes shouting, his grip on the wheel unnervingly tight. Some passengers had already noticed the smell of burning minutes before the crash, but in the stillness of the early morning, they had no time to react. As the bus picked up speed, dashcam footage would later reveal it swerving recklessly, overtaking a Honda Odyssey at a sharp corner. At 1:10 a.m., on a downhill stretch with no streetlights, everything went wrong. The driver lost control. The massive vehicle lurched left, smashed into the back of a Perodua Alza, and then spun wildly. The guardrail meant to stop such a disaster bent and tore through parts of the bus as it overturned, sending passengers flying into nearby ditches. Windows shattered, metal shrieked, and in seconds the bus was torn apart. Many students never even had time to scream. They had been asleep when their journey ended. Drivers behind the bus described the scene as a nightmare unfolding before their eyes. The overturned bus lay mangled near a ravine. Steel and glass scattered across the road. Survivors stumbled out in shock, covered in blood, while others lay crushed beneath the wreckage. The minivan that had been struck was crumpled on the roadside, its passengers badly injured but alive. A passing motorist rushed forward to shut off the bus's engine, fearing an explosion. There was no fire, but the cries of those trapped inside echoed in the darkness. Emergency services rushed to the scene, but rescue was slow. Firefighters cut through the metal shell to reach trapped students. By dawn, 13 were confirmed dead at the roadside, and 2 more died later in hospital. The death toll stood at 15, with 33 others badly injured. For their families, many of whom had hugged them goodbye just hours earlier, the news was shattering. In the days that followed, grief spread across Malaysia. Social media was flooded with condolences. Hashtags like Absi Berduka and Tragedy Garrick uniting the nation in mourning. Leaders, including Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim, issued statements of sympathy. The investigation only deepened the anger. Survivors said the bus had been speeding recklessly, and dashcam footage confirmed it. The driver later insisted the brakes had failed, but inspection showed no mechanical fault. Worse still, records revealed he had 18 prior traffic summonses, 13 of them for speeding. The bus company was no better, caught violating multiple safety standards and even subletting its operating permit illegally. The bus itself, though serviced in May, was an older model exempt from newer safety rules. There were no seat belts for passengers. This was not just bad luck, it was a tragedy waiting to happen. The driver, 39-year-old Mod Amirul Fadil Zulkifli, was charged with 15 counts of dangerous driving and 1 of reckless driving. He pleaded not guilty and was released on bail, even as funerals continued. The company behind the bus saw its license revoked immediately after regulators uncovered its safety breaches. It was a clear afternoon in Santa Clarita on November 30th, 2013, when Paul Walker, best known for his role as Brian O'Connor in the Fast and Furious franchise, climbed into the passenger seat of a Porsche Carrera GT. At the wheel was his close friend and racing partner Roger Rodas. The two had just left a charity event for Walker's Foundation, Reach Out Worldwide, meant to support victims of Typhoon Haiyan. It was supposed to be a day of goodwill and laughter, but within minutes, tragedy struck. The Porsche roared down Hercules Street, a stretch of road known to car enthusiasts. But the Carrera GT was a dangerous machine, powerful, temperamental, and notoriously unforgiving. At around 3:30 p.m., traveling at speeds between 80 and 93 mph on a curve marked 45 mm, Rodas lost control. The car slammed into a lamppost and 2 trees in a catastrophic impact. Both men were knocked unconscious instantly. Flames erupted almost immediately, turning the Porsche into an inferno. Friends from the charity event sprinted toward the smoke, fire extinguishers in hand, desperate to save them. Among them was Antonio Holmes, who had just spoken with Walker minutes earlier, but the fire was relentless. Witnesses described the unbearable helplessness of watching as the men remained trapped inside. In seconds, the car was reduced to a twisted shell of steel engulfed in flames. By nightfall, news had spread worldwide. The image of the charred red Porsche was broadcast everywhere, a grim symbol of loss. Paul Walker was gone at just 40 years old. For fans, the shock cut deep. On screen, Walker was the man who always walked away from the wreck. In real life, fate offered no retakes. Investigations revealed no alcohol, no drugs, no racing, just speed and aging tires that made the car uncontrollable. The Carrera GT, already infamous, had once again shown how deadly it could be. The irony was cruel. The actor who embodied speed and survival was claimed by the very thing he loved. His death sent ripples through Hollywood. Production of Furious 7 halted as Universal Pictures struggled to complete the film without him. Eventually, his brothers Cody and Caleb helped finish his remaining scenes, aided by digital effects. When the film premiered, it carried a farewell that resonated worldwide. The tribute song, "See You Again," became a global anthem of grief and remembrance. Yet, Walker's legacy was more than movies. After his passing, countless stories of his generosity surfaced, like the time he secretly purchased a wedding ring for a military couple who couldn't afford one. To his friends and family, he was a humble, kind-hearted man, far removed from Hollywood excess. To his daughter Meadow, he was simply Dad. On the night of March 13th, 2012, deep inside the Sierre Tunnel in Switzerland, what began as an ordinary journey home from a school skiing trip turned into one of the darkest tragedies in modern European road history. A coach carrying 52 people, 46 children and 6 adults, was making its way back to Belgium after a week of snow and laughter in the Swiss Alps. Parents back home were expecting phone calls, pictures, and stories about mountains and friends. Instead, what they received was the unthinkable. The bus had only just begun the long ride home when disaster struck. Shortly after 9 p.m., the vehicle veered inside the tunnel. In the space of just a few seconds, it clipped the curb, then slammed head-on into a concrete wall at the end of an emergency turnout. The front of the coach folded in on itself with brutal force, crushing those seated at the front and trapping many of the children inside. In the dark, confined tunnel, the sound of the impact echoed like an explosion, followed by silence broken only by cries for help. Rescue workers who rushed to the scene would later describe what they saw as apocalyptic. The entire front of the coach was destroyed, leaving passengers pinned in twisted metal. Windows had to be smashed open to pull children out. 8 helicopters and over a dozen ambulances were deployed in a desperate attempt to save lives. Some children, dazed and bloodied, were carried to safety. Others never made it out. When the chaos cleared, the scale of loss became unbearable. 28 people had died, including both drivers, all 4 teachers and 22 children, most of them just 10 to 12 years old. The remaining 24 pupils were injured, some critically, with several flown to hospitals in Lausanne and Bern for emergency surgeries. Doctors worked through the night, performing dozens of operations on broken bones, brain injuries, and crushed chests. Families in Belgium, who had waved their children off only days before, now found themselves on planes to Switzerland, summoned to identify the bodies of their sons and daughters. Among the victims was 11-year-old Sebastian Bowles, a British boy with Belgian ties. His parents flew in to face the unthinkable task of saying goodbye. The grief was so raw that even seasoned police officers guiding families to the crash site broke down in tears. The people of Sierre, though strangers to the victims, opened churches and chapels, lit candles, and wept alongside the families. Speculation over what caused the tragedy filled the air in the weeks that followed. Investigators ruled out alcohol, fatigue, and technical failure. Rumors swirled. Was it human error? Did the driver reach to change a DVD in the onboard entertainment system? Or was it simply a split-second mistake in the worst possible place? The official inquiry ended by attributing it to a non-criminal error, but for the grieving families, no answer could ever be enough. In Belgium, the impact was felt like a national wound. A day of mourning was declared, flags flew at half-mast, and military planes repatriated the bodies of the children and teachers. Entire communities fell silent as coffins were carried into local churches, the air heavy with disbelief. Teachers, classmates, neighbors, everyone seemed touched by the enormity of the loss. What makes this tragedy so haunting is not just the numbers, but the cruel contrast between what was and what should have been. Just hours earlier, these children had been skiing, laughing, and taking photos with their friends. They should have been coming home with stories to tell, souvenirs to show, and memories to last a lifetime. Instead, parents were left with silence, empty beds, and the unbearable ache of absence. Years later, a memorial was built near the crash site in Sierre, a circle of trees planted above the tunnel to honor the 28 lives lost. It stands as a reminder of that night when joy turned to horror in an instant, when children never returned home, and when two nations were united in grief. For those who lost sons, daughters, friends, or colleagues, the memory of that tunnel remains a scar that will never fade, a reminder of how fragile life can be and how sometimes the most ordinary of journeys can end in unimaginable tragedy.